It's a real honor for me to speak at this conference. Teilhard de Chardin was, or is one of my dad's heroes, and he played a very critical role in my own intellectual formation. In fact, when I called my parents yesterday to tell them that I was flying up to Berkeley to speak at a conference on the Noosphere, my dad just shouted in the background, "Yay!" And I could hear him shaking his hands joyfully in the air. So we're here to celebrate and reflect on this idea of the noosphere. In choosing this term by analogy with the term biosphere, Teilhard was making a striking claim for the significance of mind, thought, and consciousness. The, quote, growth outside and above the biosphere of an added planetary layer, an envelope of thinking substance, was an epochal event in his view. Not only the rise of a new form of inheritance, as Teilhard of course noted, but the rise of a novel capacity to draw together the unfolding and complexifying strands of evolving life. But what is this noosphere made of? If it is like the biosphere in a deep sense, what are its ecologies? What is its evolutionary dynamic? I want to try to take some steps toward answering those questions today, and I think a key ingredient in this story is the concept of culture. Now, culture, as many of you no doubt know, is a very challenging concept to think with, but I want to start by making a deep connection between the notion of culture and the notion of intelligence. As my collaborator David Krakauer put it, intelligent mechanisms help agents encode reality, make life more ordered, make the world a better one for living in, and give predictability, coherence, adaptability, and creativity to life. I think you could just replace the word intelligent mechanisms with the phrase bits of culture, and this statement would be entirely true. But what is culture? A famous 1952 attempt to gather definitions by Kroeber and Kluckhorn yielded 164 distinct answers. Don't worry, I'm not going to sit here and tell you what all of those are. Instead, I'm going to proceed not in terms of contents, the way that social scientists often do. That is saying something like, well, culture consists of beliefs, values, norms, institutions, practices, etc. Instead, I want to focus on certain formal properties of culture. In other words, to take a kind of computational perspective. And although I won't use much formalism today, I'm drawing on this notion of computational thinking as an explanatory strategy, one inaugurated by Turing, in which we try to develop a kind of abstract model of some computational process. And if you want to read a lot more about this in gory detail, I wrote a paper a few years ago in the journal Poetics that talks about this computational way of thinking about culture. So I define culture in my own work as any shared regularity in the organization of experience or the generation of action that's acquired through social life. You could, if you wish, put it a bit more formally and say something like this: for some agent P, M, P being the bit of culture, a cultural program that is learned through participation in social life, and this P is similar to some P primes found in other agents, where M is representing the kind of substrate on which that program is running. So what is a sort of naturalistic ontology of culture that we might adopt if we want to try to study it in a truly scientific fashion? An ontology that, instead of focusing on contents, focuses on causal processes, focuses on formal similarities, focuses on what culture is really about. To give such an account, I follow the causal and materialist account developed by the French anthropologist Dan Sperber, who defined a cognitive causal chain as a sequence of cognitive processes linked by input-output relations, a causal chain in which each link instantiates some kind of semantic relationship. Now, Sperber uses the word representation to refer to the output of some information processing device, so the thing that flows along these cognitive causal chains are representations. It's quite striking, actually, to consider how ahead of his time Sperber was in emphasizing the fact that culture, and indeed mental contents, participate in this very curious intermingling of material and abstract. The physical causal processes in which representations participate tend to instantiate abstract or semantic relationships, where those relationships include things like truth, satisfaction, justification, similarity of content, and so forth. And indeed, he comes very close to a point of view in the kind of philosophy of representations that's called teleosemantic, in which a causal chain, a cognitive causal chain, is a causal chain in which each of the processes involved has the function of instantiating certain type of semantic relationship. So in other words, with culture, we're dealing intrinsically with this intermingling of the causal and the semantic, the material and the formal. Now, some of these cognitive causal chains flow between people. Sperber calls these social cognitive causal chains, and those are really the sort of proximate bedrock of social interaction. You could think of those as the sort of synapses in the incipient noosphere, noting that such chains require public productions of some sort, some of which are themselves representations, in the sense that their function is to create particular mental states or mental representations in others. And this indeed is a critical distinction that often social scientists thinking about culture neglect: the difference between what is in our heads and what is out there in the world, between the mental and public representations. Now, once those public representations are out there in the world, the process by which they form mental representations in the minds of recipients is not a one-to-one process. And of course, this is a source of great debate between different traditions in cultural evolution, the Sperberian tradition emphasizing very heavily the role of a range of transformational processes that map between what you all are hearing as I'm saying these words and the representations that are formed in your heads. Among other things, processes of transformation driven by attention, differences in motivation, differences in pre-existing mental contents that you're bringing to the table as you're engaging in this link in the chain. Now, for some of these social cognitive causal chains, the representation in question flows to a non-trivial fraction of a given population, and these cultural cognitive causal chains are really our focus. They are the things that participate in the basic ecology of the noosphere. And one of the things that's very interesting about these chains is that the public representations in question can be very durable. They can travel very widely. If you think about books or monuments or signs or radio or televisions or movies or tweets or toots or whatever we are supposed to call things that happen on X now, all of those things are public representations. All of them travel far and wide. All of them persist long over time. And indeed, even our public productions can be very durable and widely circulating. Sperber gives a very evocative example in which the entanglement of the biosphere, the geosphere, and the noosphere is especially prominent, in which people follow a trace of a path over many generations in a sort of human instantiation of this, the notion of stigmergy, the way that modifications of the environment affect the behavior of other organisms. So, these cultural cognitive causal chains are the things that are really of interest if we're trying to talk about an ecology of the noosphere, but we should note that culture itself is a variable property, and really what I should say is cultural is a variable property. Cognitive causal chains vary in how cultural they are. It is possible to have entirely idiosyncratic mental representations, or ones that are shared across a dyad or a small group, these kind of idiolects that humans are extremely good at forming and circulating. Those are kind of minimally cultural, but as things become more and more common in a relevant population at a particular moment in time, those chains in question become more cultural. And it is this ability to be drawn together, to be drawn into the same mental world, that is, I think, an important foundation for the growth of the noosphere. In fact, in some sense, I was thinking during Terry's talk that you could almost think of the size of these shared cultural lineages as being almost growing like little patches of lichen on the surface of the noosphere, where now we're experiencing an age in which these patches of lichen are intermingling and growing much, much larger than they have before in human history at much faster time scales. Returning to the previous definition of culture, this term shared regularity is doing a lot of the work. And what we want to focus on are mental representations that have a certain family resemblance to one another, that are relatively common in the relevant population at a particular moment, and relatively social in their origins. I say this just to point out that I do not require, as in some kind of like highly mimetic theories of culture, the notion that the representations have to be exact. That's largely impossible. They're sort of tokens of a similar type. They're mutually recognizable as instances of the same broad thing. And because Teilhard was very interested in the way in which the noospheric perspective also affected the way that we think sociologically, I want to point out that this vocabulary actually gives us a very nice language for talking about something that is a big topic in the social sciences, the notion of institutions, where we can think of cultural programs acting over institutions as bits of cultural programs that act over people, shaping what other cultural programs we acquire. That's a general property that cultural programs have that we'll talk about in just a second when I get into the evolutionary story. But if you think more specifically about an institution is the distribution of a set of representations that's governed by representations belonging to that same set. To unpack that a little bit, what this is saying is people's participation in an institution equips them with representations that sort of decide which people need to have which representations. And this is very similar to a definition of institution that Crawford and Ostrom introduced in a beautiful paper on the grammar of institutions from the mid-90s, where they talk about how institutions describe the attributes of people that they apply to. They include deontic statements like should or must. They include the sort of aims, the kinds of conditions in which you're supposed to do particular things, and the consequences of failing to do them. And this in of itself is a description of these kinds of representations or sets of representations that themselves give the rules for how they apply and are distributed across other people. And indeed, this notion of how representations are distributed across people is really the explanandum. From an ecological perspective, what we should be trying to answer in a theory of culture is the joint distribution and characteristics of these cultural cognitive causal chains. What kinds of causal chains spread widely? Which chains co-appear in which individuals? And so my sort of first attempt to actually give a theory of this, I started as a project a few years ago with my student Bernie Koch, who's soon to start at the University of Chicago, and an evolutionary biologist named Daniele Silvestro. And the basic theory, furniture of this theory is very similar to what I've been telling you about so far. This distinction between personal culture, the mental representations of things in people's heads, and public culture, the cultural things, the productions and representations that circulate out there in the world, where we're interested in following, as before, these chains going from personal culture to public culture to personal culture back again. And one of the things that we introduce in this paper is this notion of cultural forms, basically the types of which linked personal and public culture are tokens. Now, if you will forgive me, things are going to take a weird turn, because I'm going to tell you about a case, the case that we studied in this paper, which is metal music. So thanks to a wonderful anonymous informant who goes by the name of Hellblazer, we were given access to the Encyclopedia Metallum, a very fascinating early instance of noospheric activity. There are sessions later in this meeting on Wikipedia. The Encyclopedia Metallum is a collectively curated encyclopedia of metal music that has been around for about as long as Wikipedia, so for more than 2 decades. And what we were interested in studying with this remarkably complete collection of data about the history of metal music was what affected the dynamics, the appearance and disappearance of bands, which we think of as ideas. A band is more than just its physical instantiation. It's the ideas of the band, the artifacts it produces, the whole cultural form that in this case would be rather oddly labeled amorphous. This is the kind of noospheric life form that we wanted to study the evolutionary dynamics thereof, where really what we are trying to understand is the drivers and variation of birth rates, in other words, the way in which one cultural entity gives rise to other cultural entities, and death rates, the rate at which they disappear. And our fundamental premise, which we do a tremendous amount of work to try to validate, is that bands are competing for heads, for time, for attention, for memory, basically for the cognitive bandwidth of individuals. And using this framework that we develop, we're able to quantitatively explore across this many-decade history the presence of various evolutionary mechanisms that show up in characteristic ways in the changes in birth and death rates and characteristic ways in the changes of the population. So, for example, we can look at mass extinction, which corresponds to a kind of spike in death rates, and then a subsequent ramping up of birth rates to fill the space that has been cleared. Competitive dynamics in which competition for some fixed carrying capacity leads over time the birth rates and death rates to converge. Key innovation in which some new, you can think of like the invention of eyes or the invention of wings in the course of various evolutionary biological lineages open up new space. That typically corresponds to a relaxation of competitive pressure, a increase in birth rates, a decrease in death rates, which then converge, and then various kinds of exogenous forcing. And the first thing to say is that we find across this history no quantitative evidence for the presence of mass extinction. So to tell you how to read this figure, the dotted line is the empirical year-by-year rates of birth and death. Birth rates are in blue, death rates are in red. The solid lines are fits using something called reversible Markov chain Monte Carlo that basically try to model this process, which especially with small populations is very noisy, through a series of data-driven shifts in birth rates and death rates. And so what you can see here is that there is absolutely no evidence for the kind of big spike in death rates that you might expect with some kind of mass extinction. But we similarly find no evidence for a pure competitive process. You will note that the empirical rates show this very interesting dynamic that are not at all captured by a simple competition model where you have some fixed carrying capacity and then the lineages are competing for that. Interestingly enough, for those of you to whom this sort of thing is interesting and who can read the mathematics, we actually came up with an improved model of competition relative to the evolutionary literature that more closely mathematically formalizes this notion that with the carrying capacity completely empty, birth rates are at a maximum, death rates are at a minimum, and then as that carrying capacity is filled, they converge one to another. What we find instead is that some dynamical increase in the carrying capacity relaxes competition. So the only thing that actually differs between this equation and this equation is that you will note KT, the thing denoting the carrying capacity, now has a T in it. In other words, it's a dynamic quantity. And we can actually infer the dynamics of that carrying capacity over time if we assume a basic functional form. And this is the inferred carrying capacity dynamic that we find. The carrying capacity increases tremendously in the late 70s and early 80s. We're going to explain how that happens in just a second. It's a fascinating story. But one of the things I want to point out to you is that this model is actually very parsimonious given the close fit to the data that obtains. So what does this actually mean here? What is really going on? Well, we had an idea, and this idea was that by close analogy with key innovation, the niche, the carrying capacity is expanding, the niche is increasing through novelty. Now, what I'm showing you at the top here is the birth rate not of bands, but the birth rate of new genres. In other words, human creativity, the generation of novelty, can expand the niche by making new bits of cognitive territory available, either in existing metalheads who now have some different place to slot a new band, or by converting new groups of people with this new interesting sound. Now, of course, these new niches have to be recognizably metal, so there are formal constraints, but there are a set of kind of core parameters that can be tuned or changed, subject to what we call the principle of sufficient difference. That is, that the things have to be different enough for each other that you can slot them into distinct mental categories, until there are no more ways of varying these core parameters that are still recognizably metal music. And so what you see over time is that eventually, as these new genres, things like death metal and thrash metal and doom metal are created, they kind of work through this space of possibility. Each of these new cultural niches relaxes competition, and within it unleashes a new dynamic in which yet further subgenres are created through a combinatorial process. This bears very interesting connections to some of the work Terry has been doing on the way in which ways of relaxing competition can lead to increased combinatorial variation. Everything at this lower level follows a kind of classic competition dynamics. And this was the thing, very rarely it happens, at least in my scientific career, that you have kind of a prediction that just is borne out like beautifully when you do one crucial analysis. But this was a case of that for me. We looked and, so the thing on the left, the purple figure, is inferred basically by some elaborate machine learning to say, what would the change in the niche have to look like in order to best account for the changes in births and death rates of bands that we observed. The thing on the right is saying, given carrying capacities corresponding to each of these genres, if we make those carrying capacities available as the genres are introduced, what would the carrying capacity look like? And as you can see, those are strikingly similar to each other, and to me was completely convincing that we had basically cracked the puzzle of what was relaxing competition in this case. So I want you to recall this earlier point that I made, linking culture and intelligence. But I want to go further than that and argue that actually these evolutionary analogies I've been making should be taken really seriously, that culture can be viewed as a form of life on the abstract understanding of life that was developed by Chris Kempes and David Krakauer in this beautiful paper from a few years ago on multiple life, which emphasizes not history, but rather formal relationships between materials, constraints, and optimization principles, most fundamentally the use of matter and energy and information from the environment in order to persist. So this is, in fact, what culture is doing. Human brains and human artifacts are the environments in which cultural forms live. Human beings are, as my collaborator David Krakauer evocatively put it, a vast forest of brain trees in which cultural forms live for at least part of their life cycle. Carl Jung, many years ago, described cultural forms like artworks as autonomous complexes, things that feed on the time and attention of their creators, luminous parasites, in the words of Phil Ford and J.F. Martel of Weird Studies, my collaborators. So from this point of view, we really should start to ask about the ecology of minds in which these cultural forms are interacting with one another, where we can view innovation processes, the introduction of novelty as a kind of niche construction. And I just want to give you a couple of fascinating examples of the ways in which cultural forms interact with and change the ecological conditions one of the other. So one classic cross-cultural study by Cole and Bruner looked comparatively at list learning amongst American school children and Capelli rice farmers, and found that typically American school children, who are very used to being forced to memorize lists of random pieces of information, outperformed the rice farmers unless those lists were incorporated into stories, which was a culturally meaningful and routine way of storing pieces of information. So this is an interesting case in which those culturally mediated cultural forms having to do with sort of list learning routines or story learning routines affected the acquisition of new bits of culture. And there's, of course, a very famous and beautiful example of this going back to the very early history of studies of cultural transmission by Frederick Bartlett, in which English students exposed to a Native American ghost story later recounted it with features of English ghost story elements substituting for Native American ghost story elements. Or another example I love from the work of my colleague Gabriel Rossman, the spread of different musical songs within different musical genres actually works differently. The diffusion process operates differentially as a function of how familiar the category is. Another way of thinking it is that basically these diffusion processes work as an ecological process in which the presence of those categories in people's minds actually sort of prepares the field, as it were, for the diffusion of specific instances of those categories. The Berkeley sociologist Ann Swidler, writing just over 2 decades ago, said that the biggest unanswered question in the sociology of culture is whether and how some cultural elements control, anchor, or organize others. I think we can definitively answer the whether question with a loud yes. And as for the other parts, that's really a key element of our understanding of the ecology of the noosphere, and a project that I, and I hope many others, choose to continue to pursue. So, moving towards a conclusion, I want to note the typical point of view that humans kind of give rise to culture. But what I want us to ponder is what the foregoing discussion about culture, cultural forms, the evolutionary dynamics of cultural forms suggests about how we should really think about a human being. And I started thinking about this seriously in the context of a dialogue at the Santa Fe Institute about how we should think about a large language model. Now, being in the Bay Area, I cannot help but bring up the very common Shoggoth meme representation for thinking about large language models like ChatGPT, in which what you're encountering is some alien agent on whom a sort of human illusion of agency has been pasted. My colleague Ida Momenejad at Microsoft Research came up with a much better way of talking about it, in my view, in which a large language model is a sort of cacophony based on billions of past human minds. I like this. It's a kind of necromantic definition. And what I want to argue is, thanks to our participation in culture, thanks to our participation in the noosphere, this is true of humans as well. In both cases, we are channeling this cacophony of the output of past minds towards a range of different goals. Of course, with us, it is not literally the ghosts of past human minds, but rather their traces, the cultural organisms that they've produced and circulated, along with our own experiences, our novel thoughts and ideas that make up the contents of our consciousness, which, as Terry pointed out, the latter bits, the novel thoughts, the ideas, may be more and more heavily attenuated relative to the rapidly circulating cultural organisms that we encounter through our engagement with screens and other devices. So I want to argue that a noospheric view actually inverts this relationship, in which culture really gives rise to the human. In fact, my friend J.F. Martel, in his book Reclaiming Art, said precisely this: it is not that humans created art, rather that art, or more broadly culture, created the human. And indeed, this is something that Teilhard, I think, would support. In 1947, he wrote, quote, "From the moment when the phyletic strands begin to reach toward one another, weaving the first outlines of the noosphere, a new matrix coextensive with the whole human group was formed about the newly born human child, a matrix out of which he cannot be wrenched without incurring mutilation in the most physical core of his biological being." And this is exactly what Terry was talking about with his concept of symbolic eusociality. So to conclude, I want to address the broader significance of our participation in the noosphere, which has to do with the question of meaning. Now, this is something that I have struggled with for a long time, and finally kind of came to grips with through the work of this guy, a mathematician and physicist named Stan Ulam. The philosopher and mathematician Giancarlo Rota recounts an encounter he had with Ulam where they were talking about the question of intelligence, and particularly the question of artificial intelligence. And they were discussing this idea of a barrier of meaning, something that artificial intelligence seemed to have difficulty cracking. And Ulam said, when you perceive intelligently, as you sometimes do, you always perceive a function, never an object, in a set theoretic or physical sense. This is a very kind of initially confusing and challenging statement, which it took me like 2 decades to fully understand. But I want to tell you what I think he's saying in terms of how we should think about meaning. Meaning is a relationship between something out there in the world, some facticity, which is the term that he uses riffing on Husserl, and what he called a function, but I think is better called a role. In other words, you can think about, say, a playing card. You have the facticity of the card, the Queen of Hearts, and then you have the role that that card plays in the context of, say, a game of bridge. And this relationship between the facticity and the role is what Husserl calls a Fundierung relationship. And what's very interesting about this relationship between facticity and role is that the content matters more than the sort of literal words on the page, yet the content somehow exists less than the words on the page. In other words, meaning matters more than facticity, somehow exists less than the facticity. And what I want to suggest is that we need to formalize this as relation that is really at the heart of this Fundierung relation, to see a card as a trump in a game of bridge, to understand the notion of analogy. And this analogical act, this as relation, is about imagination. It's about seeing what is as what could be, but it's very hard. It's key to the story, but we don't even know where to begin. And I think what this has to do with is the relationship between the actual world and the possible world, that this barrier of meaning is separating the facticity from the function, the facticity from the role, the actual from the possible. Or, to use a term I like very much, coming from the French scholar of religion, Henri Corbin, the work of the great Andalusian philosopher Ibn Arabi, the imaginal. This land of nowhere, this space of possibilities, this, I think, is really where the noosphere resides, a mental space that we're able to visit together, where some parts of that mental space stand in particular relation to our world, thus enabling us to understand and manipulate that world. We're increasing that portion of the imaginal that corresponds to our physical world, and thereby increasing this patch of the imaginal that we call understanding. This is the sense in which the noosphere is actually acquiring a literal geological force. And I want to suggest, as a kind of amusing evolutionary story, that basically, through some emergent accidental entry into the imaginal realm, we finally ran into some subset of that space of the capacity to imagine possibilities that constituted understanding. Stanley Kubrick famously captured this with the notion of the hominin suddenly realizing that the bone could be used for many different things. Abusing William Burroughs, we cut into the imaginal by chance, understanding leaked out, natural selection seized on that cut and expanded it, and now this is one of the core functions of our brains. I think this core function actually plays a critical role in the universe itself in the following sense. The purpose of life, on my view, is, among other things, to generate novelty. The universe, as Leibniz said, obeys a kind of principle of maximum variety, the greatest variety possible with the greatest possible order. And so culture and mind helps us actually engage in that process of generating novelty, generating new problems, and through its capacity for self-reflection, actually thinking and judging the ways in which we bring novelty into the world, making us conscious explorers of the world of the possible. I want to emphasize here that in this representation, the actual world is a garden with humanity and nature in a carefully tended balance, and I believe we have a similar duty of stewardship and care towards the noosphere as we have towards the biosphere. But alas, as Terry pointed out, we are currently failing tremendously, and in order to realize Teilhard's vision, we need to treat the noosphere like the garden that we should have treated the world. I want to thank the folks for funding this work, and thank you all for your patience. Sorry for going a little over.
These are wonderful talks, and of course they're so very smart, but I want to voice a concern. And the concern is that when we look at either nature, biological nature, or culture, what we find are little islands of functional organization, something that might qualify as an organism, in an ocean of other processes in which these islands are participating, but those oceans are not themselves functionally organized. And so the kind of analysis that's called for anything that qualifies as an organism, whether it's a cultural organism or a biological organism, is different than the kind of analysis that's called for vast aggregates. For example, in biology, an organism or a species highly adapted to its environment is different than a population of those organisms or an ecosystem composed of those organisms. And what I find is, in these kinds of analysis, is an insufficient awareness of what we're talking about. Are we talking about something which is functionally organized, or this larger aggregate? What I find is that the conversation and the analysis kind of toggles back and forth between them without realizing that, at least in my view, that there's a very different style of analysis. And in a practical sense, what we need to do, if we're going to have any kind of noosphere that in the Teilhardian sense, is to basically to work towards a whole earth and everything underneath it as like an organism. So it's a very important question. And I just wanted to raise the whole issue. I'm raising a very large issue for Terry and for you and for everyone in this audience. Thank you.
I will admit, David, I saw you in the audience with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. And of course, you have put your finger on precisely the thing that, reflecting on my talk, I was most anxious about, which is this question of sort of levels of analysis and the way in which, although we try very much in particularly the paper I was pointing to be careful about some of those issues, and I think we're more careful than a lot of people are. I think you're exactly right that the question, which I think is in some sense an empirical question, is to try to understand the degree to which, when you're thinking about, say, a cultural organism, whether that's an appropriate term to use, what are the sort of boundaries to draw around it, in the sense that people like, Jessica Flack, David Krakauer, and Nihat I, who are trying to think about what these questions of biological individuality, which I think are related questions here, but then also this issue of functional organization. And again, I think in various attempts to come up with there's the work of Dave Wolpert and Artem Kruchinsky, trying to come up with this semantic theory of information that appeals to some kind of functional role in this case, the survival of the organism. I think there are similar moves that you can make that the teleosemantic approach to representation kind of has a certain functional flavor, but I absolutely agree that what is needed is for us to be sort of pitilessly attentive to these issues of boundaries, scales, and what kinds of explanations are appropriate to different phenomena with different degrees of functional organization. So totally, yes.
I'm Arpita Roy from Anthropology, working under the direction of Professor Terry Deacon. I have a question for Jacob on the conceptual definition of boundaries. Minor question. So you started your last point on the barrier between the actual and the possible.
Yes.
And you gave the example of these metal bands, which the grammar survives even if the community of artists dies out, right? But then I want to go, so there is how should I say, an excess that can be tapped into, the potential that remains, right? But then to go back to your first point, does it not get contradicted where you introduced Dan Sperber's definition that culture is the mapping of all the representations that are there? And in fact, I would think then that that is contradicted, and a better model would be Kurt Gödel's, where the presuppositions lie outside the system. They're not exhausted by the representations that are there. So I agree and accept your point that there is untapped potential and that belongs to the realm of culture, but then the conceptualization of that, which you gave in terms of Sperber's definition, does not do justice to it. Maybe or maybe not.
Yeah. Yes, definitely a little small point. I think the distinction I would make is between what is the appropriate definition from a sort of analytic perspective, where I think Sperber's approach is a very reasonable way to start, and a sort of ontological perspective or metaphysical perspective. And indeed, I think this, thinking what this sort of metaphysical excess is, what the possible, without appealing to the way that, as a physicist, we might be comfortable thinking about state spaces, or mathematicians are comfortable thinking about, the Platonic spaces of possible mathematical entities, what the heck that is and how to connect that to the kind of more materialist way that Sperber wants to approach it, I have no idea. But fortunately, we're sitting next to each other, so I'll have more time to think of the answer.